Good evening. Thanks for coming again. Okay, Gatsby v2. So Gatsby v2 has recently gone from beta into production, and it brought a bunch of changes. And if you're excited about Gatsby and you were messing around with Gatsby v1, as I know many of the hundreds of people in the audience were, then you'll be excited about v2. Okay, so what does v2 mean? The first question is, what changes did v2 bring? Like, what is new in Gatsby v2? And the second question is, do you want to upgrade? Does it make sense to upgrade today, or do you want to upgrade later? Yeah, so I start with changes. One of the biggest things that came in with Gatsby v2 is that the upstream packages all got updated. So Gatsby is built on like a bunch of upstream packages, React obviously, but also some others. So React got up to version 16, which introduces a few small things. It also makes server-side rendering much more efficient, which is a big win for Gatsby because they're doing a lot of React server-side rendering. Webpack got updated to version 4. So Gatsby uses Webpack to build a lot of the bundles and sort of combine CSS files and stuff like that under the hood. And therefore, the upgrade to Webpack 4 brought some improvements, I think mostly around build times. And Babel went up to version 7, which means, I'm not exactly sure what. I think you can use some slightly fancier ES6 or ES7 syntax. Also, Babel 7 is way more complicated. You don't get a whole bunch of stuff automatically, but Gatsby solves most of that for you. So the biggest effect of all these upstream updates is that the build times, they really did a lot of work on build times, and the builds got significantly faster. So that's the first and the biggest advantage of v2, is that when you're running the build process, it now runs a lot faster. Little things like it can run on multiple cores, it'll take advantage of multi-core machines, yada, yada, yada. The other another significant change is that the client-side build of Gatsby got 31% smaller. So the output of Gatsby got smaller. One of the things that was introduced with v2 is this idea of multiple builds. So there is some work going on, like, I don't know how many people are familiar with the sort of JavaScript ecosystem, the build chains, how all that stuff works, and so on. A little bit. Maybe 40% of our 300 people in the audience. So JavaScript is typically written in very modern syntax and then transpiled into syntax that your grandmother or Internet Explorer 5 can still consume. It's not literally Internet Explorer 5 anymore, but there's this huge backwards compatibility thing. And what that means is that when you use some nice new feature of the newer versions of JavaScript, that gets transpiled into some gigantic polyfill, which gets loaded so that people of older browsers can still use the same functions, or you can still write the same code. One of the things that comes with the new version of Gatsby 2, because they upgraded Babel and Webpack, is that you can build different versions for different browsers. So you can say, if you're targeting the latest, like if someone is loading your site on the latest version of Chrome, they don't need all the polyfills. Like Chrome already can support the latest version, or Chrome supports a much more recent version of JavaScript compared to some older versions. Question? No? You look later. So the client got 31% smaller, which again makes it faster. The main thing about Gatsby v2 is it's faster. Everything got faster. Builds got faster, loads got faster, reloads got faster. Another major change from these updates, and also from an under-the-hood architectural change about how, in Gatsby v1, a list of every single page on your site is included in the HTML of every single page on your site. So it's like an exponential function. So with every time you add a page, all your pages get bigger. And by the time you get to a certain size, Gatsby won't build anymore and the browser won't load it anymore. So I have like my personal website has 3,500 pages, and it would not build in v1. It just, like Firefox I think would load it, but Gatsby would like fail to build it in development. It might build it for production. It was just super, super complicated. It would crash in Chrome, but it would work in Firefox because it's just loading a ton of data. Gatsby v2 has made a lot of changes to that. So now if you have sites that are more than 1,000 pages, you can build that in Gatsby v2. And that's, yeah, it also just makes the whole thing faster. You're no longer loading a list of every single page as part of every page. So yeah, that's a big win. They also added this, what they call ludicrous mode, which is essentially around hot reloading. So while you're developing on a Gatsby site, it's now much faster at updating. So if you're, for example, editing Markdown, you can essentially be typing in a Markdown file. If it's auto-saving on every key up, you can watch in near real time as Gatsby updates. It's just super fast at saying, oh, this page has changed, update that node, ship that to the browser, update the DOM. And you can kind of watch it very, very quickly following what you're doing. Not necessarily super useful when you're writing content in Markdown, but it's quite useful when you're messing around with other things, changing styles and this and that. It's just now the Gatsby development experience is much more responsive in line with what you're doing when you're building the site, which makes it faster. Another change under the hood is that there are no layouts in Gatsby v2. In Gatsby v1, there was a special type of React component that was called a layout, and those components could load data from through GraphQL. And in Gatsby v2, they have gone away, which makes life a lot simpler. So it used to be there were two ways you could get data into your components. Now you can get data into your pages through the Gatsby page system. So you say, I want a page at /about, and you can define a query that should, a GraphQL query that will be loaded and given to that page, that page's component. And you also have this new thing called static query. And static query allows you to take any Gatsby component and say, I want some data delivered into this component. So what Gatsby does, it ingests all content from all kinds of different sources, builds its own internal kind of data store, and then it exposes a GraphQL API on top of that. So when you're building your components, the way you get data from the Gatsby data store into your HTML is through GraphQL, which is back to this thing earlier about performance, which is why Gatsby can build pages that are so crazy fast, because it knows what data you need on every single page, down to the field. And you can just remove fields that you don't need from each page. So it builds these pages that are just super, super optimized. And with static query, you basically have GraphQL everywhere. You can put your data any place you want. It's called static query because it's not dependent on each page. So for example, this is a nice thing if you want to, say you have a header component that has a list of the site title, for example, or you have some meta tags that you want site-wide. You can define them somewhere, have them loaded into that component, and not have to sort of update them manually. Gatsby works offline. There's an offline package, so you can install a service worker and download all the stuff, and a lot of improvements were made on the offline thing. So with Gatsby v1, you have these weird things where you visit a site that has been reloaded, that has been redeployed, and you get a blank screen, or they're just like some weird edge cases where things would not quite work offline that would affect your kind of also your real online performance. And a lot of that stuff has been fixed. The offline experience has just been significantly improved. Another small thing in terms of developer experience, I don't know how small it is, we haven't used it yet, but it's an interesting idea, is that they added tracing. So you can start to dive into your Gatsby performance, like your build performance better. So for example, this is an example of tracing the build process. So it uses this thing that I read about today for the first time, which is called open tracing, I think. And it's a standardized system across many programming languages that you can use to instrument how long different parts of your process take. So this is kind of interesting. You can add it to your own plugins and stuff. Like you can see the different phases of the Gatsby build process and how long they took. So you get a chance to say, you know, where is your build time being eaten away or whatever. The main thing, what I would say the main change from V1 to V2 is a huge upgrade of performance. That's the biggest thing. Any questions on what Gatsby v2 has changed?
So about what you said, you can have multiple builds per environment, basically, per browser or something. Do you have to specify that manually, or is Gatsby doing
Yeah, so the question about like how do you get this thing of doing different builds for different browser capacities and how does it work? The simple answer is I don't know. I don't know enough about the details. What I understand from my limited research is that there is essentially you can define in the script tag different versions of the same script. So you can say, here's the script source, and here's the script modern source. And the browser, like an old browser, will just load source. It doesn't understand this new HTML attribute. And a more modern browser will load this newer version. That's my understanding of how it works. It's not actually called modern source versus source, but that's my understanding of the general idea. Because my thought was, how the hell do you do that with a static site? And so I did a little bit of research, and that was what I came to understand. But don't quote me on that. Yeah, it's quite a cool thing for all kinds of sites, not only for static and Gatsby, because these old, like building these massively polyfilled JavaScript builds, it's just consuming a lot of bandwidth for nothing.
So you just have to have one source. And the modern source is the same stuff, just under the hood, or?
So what I understand is that essentially there are two, for every JavaScript file, Gatsby will build two versions. It'll build the ES5 version and the ES7 version. And in every script tag, the script tag will say something, like, do you know the source sets? Yeah. You have this thing with images now where you can say, like, here's an array of sources, and you give the browser enough information to say which one the browser wants. My understanding is it's the same idea for JavaScript files. So the browser says, oh, I speak ES7, I don't need to go get your old polyfill bullshit, I can just load the new version. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I think something like Modernizer also do, right?
Yeah, it's not something that Gatsby built themselves. It's something that's built because of the upgrades to Webpack and Babel. And so now you can do these multi-thingy builds with Web. I think it's because of the Webpack upgrade. I'm not 100% sure. I am not fully clear on the distinction between Babel and Webpack.
I think it's about the type parameter. You can write script type module, for example, and module is a modern keyword, and Internet Explorer doesn't recognize that. And if you have a script type text/JavaScript, then that's for Internet Explorer.
Yeah,
I think it works kind of
always Internet Explorer.
Yeah, I think it's exactly like that. It's like, yeah, and that makes sense. The script type field and old browsers will read text JavaScript. What I don't know about the type is how because what I understand is that you specify something that modern browsers load and they know not to load the old version. So if it's just
another parameter which
yeah.
tells that to the phone.
Yeah, I guess what I imagine is it's like the source set thing. Like there's just a way to tell the browser, dependent on how modern you are, depends on which version of the script you want.
The old version is the old browser is just not possible to do it and skip it, and the new browser knows it.
But the key is that you want the new browser not to download the old version.
Yeah, okay.
So, because otherwise you would lose the benefit. Yeah. Boom. So then we come to the question to upgrade or not to upgrade. The first thing I would say is it depends on if you need something that the current version doesn't do. If you need something that's in the new version, like in Gatsby v2, then obviously you need to upgrade, right? Which means, for example, if you have a site with more than 1,000 pages, you need to upgrade it. I mean, it just wouldn't have worked in Gatsby v1. Or you might have it working, but the build times are laborious as hell. Sometimes it fails, fragile, etc.
More than 1,000 pages.
If you have more than 1,000 pages, you need to be on Gatsby v2. Like Gatsby v1 just will not quite work properly.
For example, 100K or 1 million.
Gatsby is not really yet fully optimized for like 1 million page sites. The reason is that in Gatsby v1, you had this list. The reason under the hood is to do with cache busting. So what Gatsby does is it builds out a JavaScript file for every component, for every like top level component, and it builds out a JSON file with the data for that for every component, or it's actually JavaScript, but everything ends up in JavaScript. So there's a data file and a component file. And then it has this map like that tells it for this URL, this is the file, this is the data file that you need, and this is the component file that you need. And that data file and the component file contain a content hash. So the contents of the file are hashed as part of the file name so that every time a new version is deployed, it's this cache busting thing they use in CDNs. Now the problem with that is that Gatsby loads the site and it says, I need to prefetch the content for the about page. The URL is /about. Gatsby needs a way to know what is the content hash of the about page, its component and its data file. And there's just no way for Gatsby to know that without downloading a list of pages. And so in Gatsby v1, that list of pages was in the HTML. Fine for a 50-page site or whatever. When you get up to like 500 pages, suddenly you have this giant chunk in your HTML, which is data you do not need to render the page. So that has been moved out of the HTML, but now it's loaded as a JSON file. So if you have 1 million pages, you probably can't load a JavaScript object that contains 2 million keys in the average browser.
You mean the JSON?
I mean like var a equals curly bracket key colon value. Like the browser is just unlikely to cope well with a 1 million key object because it's just a huge piece of data. And it's not really built for that. So that's one part, but the other part is you would have to download a complete list of all 1 million URLs and their corresponding content files and components. I mean, the components are mostly shared, so that would be less data, but that data file just starts to get significantly, gigantically huge as you get into the like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pages. So there's some work going on with Gatsby to shard that so that it can be downloaded in chunks. But I would guess that it's going to be at least version 3 before Gatsby is really solidly ready for 1 million page sites.
Is there a border where the performance drops? Do you have some experience with that?
The question is, does performance drop at some specific point? No, I don't have any experience, so I don't really know. I think that my experience with a large site in Gatsby v1 is that it was dependent on many different factors. So for example, it would run in Firefox, but it would not run in Chrome or Safari. Like I would get a maximum range error in Chrome or Safari, which are both use WebKit, but not in Firefox. So I think it's just not that straightforward. That's my feeling.
In production, you would get or does it have to do with like hot module reloading, which isn't optimized and stuff?
With my site, Gatsby v1, this was a production build of the site would crash the browser. Like it would hit a range, call stack or whatever error in WebKit browsers.
Okay.
Yeah. So it just was not viable. Yeah, just ask all your customers. Just tell all your users to use Firefox. Yeah, just like add a header on the page that says Firefox. Yes.
Would a static website work if you disable JavaScript in the browser?
Will a static site work if you disable JavaScript in the browser? Yes. In the Jekyll-Hugo static world, absolutely, because each page is a unique page of HTML. What makes Gatsby so interesting is that it preloads all your pages, which means when you click, you don't wait. That won't work. Ultimately, it gets built out to an Ahref, so when you click the link, your browser will just go to the server, say, give me the next page, and we'll get that page back. But what it gets back is a complete site page that contains all of the, everything that is needed to render the page. The images may break, depending on how you load images. So the images get blurred up from this low resolution version, and I have seen a case where we're working on the WordPress starter, the Gatsby WordPress starter, and something got broken as part of an upgrade. I forget exactly what, such that the JavaScript, the first build in React was breaking. So React was not booting properly. It was hitting an uncaught exception, and then the images wouldn't up blur. It would on like click 2, but the first time it wouldn't. So I'm not sure if you'll get like proper images. Depends. But that's assuming that you're optimizing the images. You know, it's not necessary.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because usually you use the static site generators compared with, I don't know, Discuss, Snipcart, or some Google stuff, and then most of the page would not be displayed, right?
Yeah, if you use like Discuss, Snipcart, yada yada, then sure, the page will not really work properly. I used to use whatever it's called, the NoScript blocker in Firefox, and my experience like several years ago is that the web just doesn't really work if you disable JavaScript. So I guess Gatsby is going to be a lot better than like a single page application site, but it's not going to be as good as something that's 100% pure HTML built by hand in Dreamweaver back in the day.
It's perfect for SEO because you have static HTML files.
Yeah, because all this the built output is 100% static, then it's great for SEO.
Yeah, in Netlify I saw they pre-rendered a site, right? Is that, I think it's improvement for the SEO part.
Netlify does pre-rendering, but what was the site built with? Do you know?
Yeah, I think with Gatsby.
So Gatsby, you don't need to pre-render. That's what Gatsby does. Like the output from Gatsby is you get hundreds of HTML files and you get thousands of data files. So there's no pre-rendering required. But if you use something like Create React App, which doesn't do any server-side rendering, then things like Netlify can have pre-rendering on top. But it depends. So we used to do a lot of work with Meteor, which is full stack JavaScript. And one of the, like prerender.io is a service that would do pre-rendering, and it was helpful for SEO. One of the major challenges is that a request would come in, the Express middleware would say, oh, this is a spider. I want a pre-rendered version. It would then go to prerender.io and say, can you give me a pre-rendered version for this URL? If pre-render didn't have it in the cache, it would then load your site, build the whole page, let the JavaScript run, capture the HTML, send it back to your server, and then your server would respond. So your pages were built on demand through a like two-step from one server to another, let all the JavaScript run process, which was just super slow. And so, yeah. Like the other thing you can do with Gatsby, for example, is you can use Gatsby even if a good chunk of your site is behind some kind of login wall. Like you can have a mixture of server-rendered routes and client-only routes that don't get rendered on the server, where all you do if you load that route is you get redirected to a login page. So Gatsby it's good for that if you have only 5 sites, 5 pages, and then you're building some complete application around. But for example, if you have an e-commerce site, Gatsby is a great choice because it's super, super fast. And then the pages that show the customer their order and address book and all this stuff, they're just not rendered on the server. Like that, you can totally mix the two.
Did you try to do something with AMP?
What is it?
Accelerated mobile pages?
Yeah, Gatsby and this AMP, Google's accelerated mobile pages thing. There is a Gatsby plugin that does sort of support that. It's not quite a drop-in and go thing. Like my understanding of AMP is that it's essentially a subset of HTML. You can use like less of the normal HTML features, which means that the pages you output are safe, and therefore Google will host them on their own domain. So Google will like preload them for you. You can, I believe, get Gatsby to do that, but it's not something that's like completely 100% supported by Gatsby. It's by a third-party plugin, and it effectively builds 2 versions of every page. So I think there's some like post-build conversion process going on where they're taking every page and building a second AMP version of it. Like Gatsby's quite well suited to that because you have a lot of control and information about what you're outputting compared to like a normal template like Hugo. But I don't know, maybe with Hugo it's easy because you just have two templates. You have like a template for HTML and a template for AMP. I have no idea. My understanding is it's possible, but it's not fit and forget today.
Maybe one thing to that, I experienced this very thing. The problem was that there are always some JavaScripts that are generated into the static sites, into the static pages, that do the things like to preload the pages and so on. So mainly the AMP integration was about removing those JavaScripts. Yeah. Because otherwise, if you use the components, you can obey the AMP requirements. But it was the things that Gatsby or other site generators, it's not just Gatsby, but other generators, they actually put in. So those are the things that you need to actually remove.
So you need to strip the JavaScript out for AMP. With Gatsby, it's not bad. There's only, I think, there's a very small number of JavaScript includes per page. So you mostly just load the generic Gatsby client-side build, and then it starts running. It then loads all the other things that it needs. So that part of it, I think, is reasonably straightforward to do the conversion. The other thing would be things like images. So if you're using Gatsby's blur up image support, you would need to then go take the image, rip out the base 64 version, get the source, put the source back in, and that would be a bit more tricky. Yeah.
We could draw everything in an SVG file image, right? A whole page, and make it clickable.
You could convert the whole site to every page to SVG.
Yeah.
And then make it a single SVG loaded in the AMP. Okay. Yeah. If you're only editing content, like right now if you have a Gatsby site with V1 and the main thing that you're doing is editing Markdown and changing the content and then rebuilding, then from my perspective, I would say, do you need to upgrade today? No, it's not a big deal. Like if you have a site with Gatsby V1, one of the nice things about Gatsby is because it does, all the magic happens at build time, you don't need to upgrade. You don't really have security vulnerabilities. There are some security things and so on, but you don't need to be too concerned about upgrading because all you built was HTML. Like there's nothing on the server that gets changed. So from a security perspective, it's just much, much, much simpler than something like WordPress. If you're changing design, so if you're changing the look and feel of the site, or if you're changing functionality, if you're adding client-side routes, or you're changing React components or whatever, essentially if you're working in React, then my advice today would probably be that yes, you'd want to upgrade to V2. There's a lot of things that you get with V2 that just make the experience nicer. And at some point, it's probably inevitable, so I would argue today is a good day to upgrade. Gatsby V2. Any other questions?